president privately has said that he welcomed this impeachment fight, but publicly we saw the anxiety even during that event at the White House.
Right. It's sort of been on two tracks, very separate tracks here. The president has bought into some of the political arguments his advisors have made in his campaign, where they point to internal polling that suggests that independents, particularly those in those key Rust Belt swing states, aren't that into impeachment, and they feel like his numbers have ticked up. Now, let's point out, there's public polling that shows the majority of Americans are into the impeachment inquiry and believe that there should be witnesses in a thorough and fair trial. But though the president thinks this could help him in 2020, perhaps, he's personally outraged, and he's not making any secret of it, both on Twitter and in the events like today in the White House with the champion LSU team. So he knows this is a personal stain on his legacy. This is the first line of his obituary. Now, granted, that first line might be the first president impeached to be reelected. Those two things can be true at once. But this is something that he knows is going to stay with him. And it's something that clearly is bothering him increasingly as we tick towards the trial starting.
And, Carol, perhaps Americans shouldn't be surprised to see this lineup of litigators that the president has put together here. A lot of them auditioned publicly on Fox News over the course of the last several months. The kind of full-throated defense that the president wants on his behalf.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Peter. You have a number of people who have been fierce defenders of the president, and then you have Pat Cipollone, who is White House counsel, and then you have Jay Sekulow, who the president is familiar with. He's comfortable with him. Sekulow helped get him through the Mueller investigation, so there's a lot of trust there. And then you have a number of people who are familiar with just generally with impeachment and how this works, given what their work that they did in the Clinton impeachment, and then just pit bulls, basically, people who have really gone and defended the president on this, who have won him over by, like you said, going on Fox News and elsewhere. But notably missing from this crowd is any House Republicans. There was some talk in the White House, as you know, that of the president possibly having some of his most vicious defenders in the House Republican caucus join this team and somehow in some form and help mount his defense in the Senate. That didn't happen.
Also missing here, Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal lawyer that some people thought may have a shot at being added to this team. The president hasn't praised these individuals at all times. Take a look at what the president had to say about Ken Starr during an interview on NBC News back in 1999 during the Clinton impeachment era.
I think Ken Starr is a lunatic. I really think that Ken Starr is a disaster. I hated the way the president handled it. It was a long and terrible process. I really think that Ken Starr was terrible.
Jake, what's striking there, so there's the president criticizing Ken Starr. He's been criticized, as we just noted. Alan Dershowitz has defended alleged sexual offenders. Pam Bondi's been involved in the Trump University scandal. Some of these folks have their own issues to deal with.
They do. And Peter, what you said at the top is really true, right? The Senate is expected, the president's allies are expected to acquit, to participate in the acquittal of Donald Trump in this trial in the Senate, which we anticipate will last anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks. But we should not underestimate the importance of how they present their case here, because Republicans who are on the fence about witnesses are going to make a judgment after 2 weeks of hearing testimony and being able to question the members of the House management, the House impeachment team, right, and the president's defense team. And if they don't like the presentation, if the president's team is really bombastic and takes this in all sorts of directions that make senators uncomfortable, who knows how they'll react? And I keep hearing this from Senate Republican leadership, to be honest with you, which is, we need to pay attention to how this trial goes, because that's going to determine whether there are witnesses. So he's made his bed. This is the team he's going with, and we'll see if they're able to put together a cogent argument. Now, is there an argument that could make Senate Republicans happy and Donald Trump happy? Now, Donald Trump has made it clear he wants a show here. He has said that he wants to subpoena Hunter Biden. He wants to be acquitted in fantastic fashion. Mitch McConnell wants a clean, short, and politically easy trial. So I'm not sure how you square that circle, to be honest with you, and it'll be interesting to see how the defense team does that.
Yeah, well, McConnell wants to protect some of those vulnerable Republicans like Susan Collins and others. Chuck, I want to bring you in here. This is what the indicted associate, the right-hand man of Rudy Giuliani, Lev Parnas, told our own Rachel Maddow as it relates to one of the leaders of this team, Jay Sekulow. Take a look.
Did you ever have any communications with the counsel of the president, Jay Sekulow, during the time that you were involved in all this?
Several conversations. One in particular, which I would have to refresh my memory by looking at my text messages with him, but it had to do with, I think it was Viktor Shokin's visa or something to do with Ukraine, and Rudy was busy at the time, and basically told me that Jay was aware of everything, that he brought him up to speed, and that I could call him, and he was on top of it.
By that, did he mean that Mr. Sekulow was aware of this effort to try to get Ukraine to announce investigations?
Oh, absolutely.
Chuck, is it a problem if one of the attorneys for the president could also be a material witness?
Yeah, theoretically, Peter, right? I mean, attorneys can't be witnesses in their own case. It's a conflict of interest. Now, Mr. Sekulow would know whether or not he did what Mr. Parnas said he did. But let's assume Parnas is right. And that's a bit of a leap. I wouldn't take everything that Parnas said at face value, but for purposes of answering your question, let's assume that it's true. Mr. Sekulow, if he were to be called as a witness, would have a conflict in this matter. Now, the strict conflict rules that we use in federal court, where we prosecute criminal cases all the time, don't really apply in the Senate. Sekulow could stay on as the president's lawyer and be a witness, I guess. I mean, there aren't really those hard and fast rules that we look to in our federal courts to help guide us. But attorneys should be very careful. And if he does have a conflict, if Mr. Parnas is right, then it might be appropriate for Mr. Sekulow to just step aside.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.